Hello and a very warm welcome to everyone joining this webinar today. My name is Liz Jewell and I work as the Family Support Counsellor with Fragile X Association Australia. Before we begin proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and all the lands on which we are meeting today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Today's webinar, Females and Fragile X Syndrome, is part of a series which addresses areas of support for people who have Fragile X syndrome. In today's presentation, Dr. Marcia Braden will build on some of the concepts previously shared in our recent webinars, including the anxiety presentation Marcia gave to us in 2021. I'm delighted to say that Marcia will present 3 more webinars for us later this year on education and behaviours. You can find links to our previously recorded webinars, as well as a list of upcoming events on our website. It's with great pleasure I open this webinar on females and Fragile X syndrome and introduce our guest speaker, clinical psychologist, educator, and internationally renowned Fragile X specialist, Dr. Marcia Braden.
Well, hello, everyone. It seems like I'm seeing you more now virtually than we ever got to do in person, so maybe that's a good thing. But I do miss seeing you all in person and being in your beautiful country. So let's go forward and celebrate the women. We're going to celebrate the females, and we're going to talk about them today. We know that there's very little in the research, we were just talking about that in the literature, about females with Fragile X. And so even though I've really looked hard for evidence to support some of my anecdotal statements that I'll be making today, just based on my clinical practice, there's a little to back it up, but it's mostly what we've observed in this population. One of the things that's really important is that you understand sort of my interest in girls and women and why. They have definitely given me a lot and taught me a lot. So that what I've learned from them is that they work really hard. And even though they have some deficits, they work hard to overcome those. They persevere no matter how high the mountain. They continue to climb with lots of determination. And those of you who have daughters or you care for individuals with Fragile X or have Fragile X yourself know this is very true. When they become discouraged, though, they tend to just rewind and try it all over again, which is so helpful to us as therapists because they're willing to take a stab at almost anything that I ask them to do. They inspire me. They continue to laugh and enjoy life even when they struggle. They're my heroes. So here are some ladies that have Fragile X and are part of my practice. And you can see various degrees of effectiveness, meaning just in terms of looking at some of the physical features. And we do know that that's in the literature, that we see some of the same physical features that we see in the guys, that they have long foreheads, long faces, those kinds of things. Some of these girls do, and then some don't. There is a variability, and I get asked this quite often. Why is there so much variability in this population? Like you'll see people who maybe in fact have lower levels of functioning, but then you see people that carry on and go to school and do very well that way. The DNA studies have been available since about the 1990s, and part of the gene that causes Fragile X expands. And you all have probably seen that in the literature. We now understand that a little bit better. When it becomes a certain size, then it starts to expand. And when it expands, it methylates, and then the function of the gene is turned off. So again, you'll see sort of varying degrees of this. It takes several generations for this to happen. The expansion may begin as small, and then the gene remains unmethylated at that point, and the symptoms don't show up. Later on, it expands more, and that's when we see that the gene is turned off. So again, various degrees depending on where it is in the process. Just a little genetics 101. We're not going to go into a lot of this, but 5 to 200 CGG repeats, and that's just a nucleotide in the DNA that repeats. And when it repeats to 200, we consider ourselves maybe a premutation. When it goes over 200, and again, this can vary a little bit by number, then it's a full mutation. The variants is not correlated with the CGG number. We kind of think, well, gosh, if it's a real big number of repeats, then the person would be more impaired. That is not true. Then we thought, well, maybe it's the inverse. So if it's a low number, they're more impaired, and that's not true either. So it dances around and gives us quite a bit of trouble, doesn't it, sometimes trying to figure that out. So instead of really looking at those repeats, we really just have a relationship with that person and understand how affected that person might be. Some people with a full mutation, some females, function in the normal range. And even some pre-mutation females have learning disabilities and manifest some of the difficulties that we see. So it just varies. That's the bottom line. If we look at these females, it's really kind of elusive because parents and teachers and support workers often don't notice those deficits, do they? These are women and girls that look perfectly normal and behave in a normal sort of way. And often we focus so much on the guys, the sons and the uncles and the brothers, that we sort of forget if we do have a girl that's affected with Fragile X, that she may be struggling as well. Girls and women usually function better than their male counterparts. And so those deficits are sort of subtle and they really aren't noticeable all the time. Those deficits are downplayed often in educational environments, and they're sort of explained away by, well, she's shy, or she's really not willing to take a risk. Or a lot of times I'll even hear that they're sort of stubborn and they could sort of get stuck and they won't be flexible. The emotional problems in females, and this is to me a very important comment, that it can be as debilitating as the developmental delays in the males. So I think that's important to remember because we focus a lot on the males. We focus on the developmental issues with the males and the cognitive issues with the males, but the emotional issues that the females present are very debilitating. We're going to talk first about cognition and learning. Again, as I said earlier, there aren't a whole bunch of studies that help us very much in terms of cognition and learning. They're sort of old, but we're going to go through what we have. This is one that I like. I think it's been replicated maybe once, but it sort of looks at 32 girls that were 18 years or younger, and they were compared with their sisters, so that didn't have Fragile X. So I found it sort of an interesting study. So again, you have kind of control for the genes. We know that they come from the same family, right? Some have a Fragile X gene and the others have a normal X. So again, that's the comparison. So there were 19 sisters and 32 of the girls with Fragile X. And the evaluations included physical exams and behavioral assessments and intelligence testing. And there were significant differences in the intellectual, the behavioral, and the physical features between the two groups. 25%, and you'll see different numbers when you search the literature, but about 25% of this Fragile X positive girls had an IQ in the mentally retarded range. Caveat, I hate that term. I don't like to use it, but it's what's in our diagnostic manual and we use it as a diagnosis. So again, below 70 on an IQ score is what they're saying here. 28% had an IQ in the borderline range, which is 70 to 84. And they had prominent ears, a lot of times shyness and poor eye contact. 31% of the Fragile X positive girls had significant attentional difficulties. Most of them were successfully treated in this study with a stimulant med. Now you're going to read different things in different articles about the attention deficit. I just read one that was actually older than this one that said there really wasn't any sort of attention deficit in the girls, any more prevalent in the girls than typical population. Personally, from my clinical experience, I certainly feel that the girls do have attention deficit. And I think it was Rondi that had talked to me about this at one point, that she said that the girls have more of an attentional deficit out of the ADHD. The boys have more hyperactivity and poor impulse control. So again, they're more inattentive and the boys are more hyper and have impulse control issues in the population. So again, when we look at this, we can see that that profile looks about the same. We know that if we really kind of tease out some of the parts of the IQ, we can see that the performance side of the IQ is basically lower than the verbal. And that just simply means those visual spatial tasks that we use sometimes when we're testing and doing IQ testing. So the visual spatial ability is lower than the verbal. And that makes sense because our girls are pretty verbal usually. They also have lower scores on, this is now breaking down the performance a little bit more, block design, arithmetic, and digit span, and most of us know that. We know that that arithmetic really does cause some problems, doesn't it? A lot of trouble with verbal abstract reasoning. And an example of this would be the Similarity Subtest, which basically is, how is a ball and a wheel alike? But then it gets much harder, and this is the American version of the whisk. I don't know if that's what's used with you guys. Jennifer could probably tell me that. You want to shake your head yes or no? I can see you, Jennifer. Yep, okay. So that particular subtest looks at, you know, some of the really abstract verbal stuff, like how is ice and steam alike? So we have to now go into, well, they're both forms of water. So you can see that the harder it gets, the more abstract, and really a lot of the girls will say, well, those are just opposites, and they really are, but you have to kind of figure out that common link. And then also the weakness in short-term auditory memory and visual spatial ability. So those are the weaknesses. And if you guys, this kind of sounds like code, but you guys understand this because you know your girls and you know the girls that you work with and you know yourselves. And so again, those are areas that are weaker, and then there's certainly some that are stronger. We hear a lot about executive functioning, don't we? That's something that many of us look at as, you know, that's kind of the hot ticket right now. Everybody's talking about executive functioning deficits, even in the LD population, learning disability population. So this looked at comparison studies and lots of different controls. And it looked like that the difference in performance of women with Fragile X with executive disorder function was really a problem for them. So again, the executive function deficit seemed consistent with the Fragile X women and girls. It was consistently low. And that it's present even when kids are young. So again, it doesn't just happen as people get older and they develop more skills. It's there at all times. The pragmatics, this is what it kind of boils down to. Pragmatics, organizational aspects of memory. Then again, the hyperactivity and impulsivity does interfere with executive functioning. And you can kind of imagine that, because if somebody doesn't remember what's being said, it's pretty hard for them to file that away in their long-term memory and then come out and rework it and execute a different way to think about what they just heard. So again, it's pretty abstract, high level, and it's something that we do definitely see with the girls. And I think a lot of this really tells us, you know, there's a lot of stats that I just threw at you. And I'm not really a stats person as much as I am a person that likes to just dig in and work with individuals. But females are often misunderstood, and they misunderstand the information that's given to them, don't they? So because they don't really clearly integrate and understand what they're hearing, they might nod and they understand that and they're going to do that. And they really are not, they have no idea of what you're saying, but they also have some pretty good body language and they're pretty able to kind of fool you, right? So it kind of disguises their confusion at the time. So they may kind of, yeah, sure, Dr. Braden, I understand. Yep, I'll do that. And if you check for understanding following that up and you ask them to repeat what they heard, they might be able to give you verbatim what you said to them, but they lack the details. And those of you who have girls with Fragile X or have worked with girls with Fragile X know that when you try to get them to tell a story sequentially, it's quite a struggle, isn't it? Because they sort of start in the middle of the story and they assume that you're there with them, that you were there and you saw what happened or whatever they're trying to tell you about. And they don't remember that they have to put all of it out there in great detail. They are verbal often. They engage in a lot of social communication. They're a lot of fun. They're very pleasant. They're very kind and sensitive. But often when you listen very closely to what they're saying, they sort of borrow these phrases. I don't know if you have had that same experience, but a lot of my girls that I see in therapy and women that I see in therapy sort of repeat something in the right context that they've heard before. And so you're like, oh gosh, they've got this. And really, they don't. So it's more about, if again, you check for understanding, you're going to realize that they really don't understand what they're trying to convey. And then those verbal misunderstandings, as you can well imagine, cause a lot of issues, a lot of emotional frustration. And parents will think, well, you said you understood that. You told me you were going to do that, when in essence, they really didn't. The lower digit span scores means that it's just really hard for them to attend to things that are really not very interesting and are sequential. You have to back it up with visuals. So parents will say to me, well, they won't do their chores, or they get lost when they're ready to clean their room and they get sidetracked on something else. Of course they do. What you need to do is lay that out with a visual kind of plan. So if you have a checklist or something visually that they can go to, or pictures, that will help them a great deal. Their lower working memory, which is part of their executive functioning deficit, is why math and math-related tests are so difficult. So working memory, if we really kind of pull that apart, it's part of the big umbrella of executive functioning. If we pull apart working memory, it requires us to use information that we've learned in one context and then transfer it into a novel application. Long division is a great example of that. So in long division, you will be using lots of different computations that obviously you can do a multiplication and then you can do a subtraction, but it has to be put into that format of long division and those steps. So each one of those steps individually, your child can do. But when you put it into long division, which is an entirely new format, it's much harder for them. Then the symbol search and the picture completion on the IQ test, that's another one that sort of gives us some problems. And it's sort of one of the things that the girls really like is that it's clerical. And they just copy over when they're taking this test. They kind of like that. They kind of like making a checklist. They like, I know one of the girls in the groups, when I had a girls group with girls with Fragile X, we were playing cafeteria and they were waitresses and they just loved taking orders and checking it off of something a menu that I had put together. They really enjoyed that. And of course they like the drama, they like the dramatics, but it was a lot of fun for them. Again, because it's those word searches, I think probably you guys are familiar with that. That's something that a lot of times our girls really do enjoy. And so again, it's sort of clerical. And that's why that symbol search and picture completion scores were higher. How do you get your daughter with Fragile X to qualify for special support? Now, this may not be a big deal. This is a slide that I kept in on purpose because in the States, we have the Individuals with Disabilities Act, and I think you have something similar there with IEPs. I remember going through some of those individual education programs. But sometimes the girls don't qualify because they really function at a level that isn't significantly low, and so they don't qualify for services. So it really depends on whatever your eligibility criteria is. Sometimes what we do here, we have an eligibility we put it under other health impaired because it's a genetic disorder, and we can get then the child qualified for special support. Sometimes ADHD will get them the support they need. So I'm just throwing that out just in case that's something that you're going to be looking at in the future. Sort of take a look at this and remember that that was something that works in the States, and it might for you as well. Remember that the girls are terribly underdiagnosed. So again, trying to convince an individual or someone in the school that your daughter needs support, or the person that you care for needs support, or you need support at school is often very difficult because it just appears that the person is functioning quite well. If they have things like attention deficit, completing homework can be a nightmare. And those of you that have that in your life, they miss instruction. Their skills are often very splintered because they sort of hear a little bit here, they're distracted by something in the classroom, then they attend again. So there's these bleeps in their learning profile. And so they don't always have the smooth uptake. The deficits in their executive functioning, making a plan and executing it, that can definitely get in the way of organizing work materials, prioritizing, deciding what I need to do first, predicting how long something is going to take. Really, really tough. So you might have a list and they sort of immediately go to the thing, and we all would, that we like the most, right? We're going to do that one first. Well, that one is going to take no time at all. But the one you don't like is probably going to take the most time because you don't like it, right? And it's probably hard for you. So again, just trying to get that all going is difficult. Keeping a clean and organized room is really tough. I remember having this, I think it was a Zoom or maybe it was on my platform. I don't remember exactly, but one of the girls that I see is in college, and we had this meeting set up because nothing was in person, and it was a really important meeting. And so we were sort of pleading our case to her caseworker, who's supposed to sort of help her get the services at the college that she needs. Well, she decided to do the Zoom in her bedroom. So right away, this was not good because just the background was a mess. So then she realized, oh my gosh, we got to, do whatever. She decides to start cleaning her room. That doesn't surprise any of you, does it? And she's pulling shoes out and putting them into boxes and different things like that. And finally, I had to say, time out. Let's pay attention to the meeting. We're having a meeting and you're trying to sort of plead your case in terms of what kinds of supports you need and accommodations. But it's that kind of thing that goes on without a filter. Some girls are dyslexic. They actually have dyslexia. They transpose the letters when they spell. A lot of them are very good readers, and they learn to read in an appropriate time frame. Just when all their peers are learning to read, they're reading as well. The problem is that sometimes they can't explain what they read. So again, that comprehension of what they've read can become difficult for them. And then it's the math. The math is really hard for them. The attentional deficits, some of the strategies that you could employ would be this checklist sort of idea, where you can redirect to get to the tasks that need to be done. You can set a timer. I always kind of do a challenge to beat the timer. Some of them get really anxious when you set the timer, so they just freak out and don't want to really do much with the timer. But we always kind of do something that's kind of makes it a challenge or a game or a quiz or something. Try to eliminate any of the distractors. The phone, the music, the videos. They always tell me, though, they do better when they have music going, right? They do their homework better. It helps them focus. And then, of course, I have to say, the evidence is that does not support what you're doing. And then the high interest tasks. Again, when they finish, give them a reward. Give them a reward of something fun that they like to do. Again, some tasks that they like to do. The executive functioning deficits number the steps because they're not going to organize what needs to be done because of their executive functioning deficit. So remember that whole thing means that you kind of pull it together and you organize a plan, but you also execute it. And I've heard from several people that are carriers, actually, pre-mutation carriers, that tell me that they're really good at gathering up a lot of crafts and things to do, but they're very, very poor at executing that. So they sort of have a craft store in their spare room, but they don't execute it, right? They don't get one of those things done or made or whatever. Great ideas, though, very creative thinkers. So if you help start that first step, oftentimes then they'll finish it. This is a really good activity that I do to build executive functioning and to kind of slow kids down, girls down especially, when we're trying to get them not to just go in an automatic, but to stop a minute and then go forward. So this is called Stroop, STROOP. You can look it up. They have different tasks, and I'm sure they market some of them, but I sort of just pirated this. It's kind of fun. So what I do is I fill the page with these words, and you can see that red is purple, but they need to read it as red. So again, that is an executive functioning. They have to focus. They have to make sure they understand what's there, and they don't get distracted by the purple. They don't get distracted and say purple because the word is red. So again, you're kind of looking at trying to focus on something and executing it in a way that requires a lot of attention, and to override that sort of impulsive idea of saying purple, black, red, yellow, whatever it is, and reading it very quickly. So the page is full. And what you do is you time that to see how many they can get correct and how many errors they make. And that's something that's really helpful. I've got another one that it looks at like a sun, just a sun icon and then a moon icon. And underneath it'll say, day and night. And some of them are mixed up in the wrong way. And of course, they cross out the one that is wrong and they circle the one that is right. Again, that's another thing where you kind of have to think of the task. The math is a problem because of the sequential part of math. The static math computation is usually not too difficult. They tend to be okay with that. They can compute. But when we get to word problems, that's when things really get difficult. I was just observing a couple of girls the other day virtually who live in the East in our country. And the teacher was doing a wonderful job of giving them real life sort of questions. And a lot of it was on an iPad so that the icons and the visuals were there. So it was a good lesson, very well thought out. Trying to kind of look at, okay, your appointment is at this time. It takes you this long to get there. What time do you need to leave the house? Well, that was tough. And that's a real life sort of thing that you want to try to lay in as the girl gets older, because that's something that she's going to want to try to do on her own if she's going to live independently. Another one was, do you have enough? So it gives you the money, and then it tells you what something costs. And you have to add that up and decide, is it thumbs up or is it thumbs down? Not for sure whether or not they have enough money. They usually opt out of higher math classes in high school, which is really okay, because if they can go forward and get some functional skills going and have something that they can do when they graduate that's a marketable skill, I say, go for it. Patterns, grids, that's one thing that works to sort of remediate this math issue. And then any math equivalent, so that if you can show a picture of something, and even if they're older and they're doing higher math, if you can look at a picture of, let's say, 6 or 7 things, and you can ask them whether it's bigger or less than the one that's beside it. It's just a visual picture to say, okay, here's 6, here's 10, which one looks bigger, which one is more. That kind of helps lay that out for them. Group math facts into patterns so that you kind of understand that 5 plus 2 is 7 and 2 plus 5 is 7. Also using rhythm and music. A lot of times just doing that really helps you lay in that memory for them. Use calculators. I'm a big fan of that. We've got them on our phones. That works beautifully. And that's a good way for them to compute. So they can go to the grocery store and figure out if they have enough money or not. Now we're really going to the debit cards for purchases. That's pretty much what people are using here. So, the only problem is they have to make sure that they check it against their balance, right? Because a lot of them will just go on and they don't have the money in their account. So the debit card won't work. And then they're very frustrated. So again, that's something that many are doing now. I want to talk to you now a little bit about the behavior of these individuals and some of the emotional issues that we see. If we look at this, we can see that Rondi looked at individuals who had Fragile X females, and she saw that about 35% of what she studied had ADHD. Also that there's shyness, social anxiety, and sort of some common anxiety features. And that was something that was done, of course, a long time ago as well. 40%, again, just straight anxiety. This is the one that I want to spend a little bit of time on, even though this is 1993 that this was looked at. The avoidant personality. I see this a lot in the girls and women that I see in therapy, that they avoid things and they're really good at it. They're really crafty at kind of avoiding what they don't want to deal with or they don't want to talk about. And then we have a few individuals who have selective mutism. And I've run across just one in all the years that I've practiced. And that girl would talk to her brothers and I hid behind a sofa and heard her talk. It was unbelievable because she wouldn't say a word to me. So again, that's something that, we really want to kind of pay attention to. And some of you in the audience may, in fact, have a girl, or you take care of a girl, or you work with a girl at school who has selective mutism. So the behavioral characteristics that we were just talking about is the shyness, and then that superficial extroversion. So they seem very gregarious, they seem very outgoing, but it's superficial. It's sort of hiding their anxiety. So you may hear them laughing and enjoying really conversation, but it's mostly just to avoid that anxiety, that feeling of anxiety. And you can understand where that would be a problem, because especially if they're dating and the fellow thinks that they're enjoying their company, and actually they're very anxious and they really don't want to be with that person. So it gives a mixed message. The poor impulse control sometimes is there, and that's difficult. Personal boundaries, I was talking about not giving my phone number out, because a lot of them want to text me and send me pictures and things that they've taken pictures of all over their neighborhood. And again, those are things that just aren't appropriate with our relationship. The nonverbal learning disability is the same as that visual spatial. So any task that's nonverbal, they have a problem with that, and they hate conflict. So they're going to avoid that at all costs. We also know that there are some psychiatric conditions. So this is comorbid with some of what we see with the girls with Fragile X, depression, obviously anxiety, and the social phobias, the obsessive stuff. And again, they can even have so much that they can qualify under obsessive compulsive personality disorder. And that usually is something that they utilize in order to kind of help with their anxiety. Those of you that have anxiety know that when we organize things and become a little bit OCD, it sort of helps us put our anxiety at bay. Some will have a bipolar or mood disorder, and some of them will qualify for dependent personality. And that's why a lot of times the girls and the women sometimes will get into a relationship that is not so good, because the male oftentimes will dominate because they're dependent. If you look at kind of how this plays out, they avoid anything that's difficult and unpleasant. They're really good at doing this. So again, I may have given an assignment in a group, and one of the girls in the group has to phone somebody and start a phone chain. So they go ahead and phone. I don't let them text. I make them talk and actually share some message. Oftentimes, they will turn their phone, they won't answer the phone. They'll just wait till it goes to voicemail. That tends to be a lot more comfortable for them to play that back. And then they may call back at a time when they know the person is at work, or they know that it's too late to pick up the phone, which we've talked a lot about. That can be extremely rude if somebody doesn't have their phone ring on mute. So again, very clever to try to avoid things, changing the subject. So they divert the attention away from the problem. Sometimes really giggling a lot and getting really silly will sort of try to divert them from the unpleasantness. And this is usually when I'm sort of pinning them down on a homework assignment and saying, did you do what I asked you to do? How did that go? I didn't get anything in my email because you were going to do X, Y, and Z. Then I get this excessive laughing and diverting the attention. Sometimes picking at scabs and wounds. A lot of you may know that the girls in your family or the girls that you take care of, in fact, may pick at something quite a bit so that they leave scars. They can yell, they can hit, and they can tear things up. One of my women who gets angry will go down to her room in the basement, and she will actually start throwing things into a garbage bag that her mother gave her. And that's the way she gets back at her mom for reprimanding her. She lives at home with her mom. Crying, this can be something that happens when they're overwhelmed. And this sort of becomes, I think it starts as a neurobiological underpinning, because maybe they're aroused, something makes them scared, or they get nervous or embarrassed, they start to cry. But then what happens with that is that it morphs into sort of this learned behavior that gets them out of things, because people are uncomfortable when somebody's crying. So again, that's kind of some of those behavioral issues, deficits. So they get stuck they perseverate on that conflict. It's just so strongly embedded in their brain, and it's something that is sharp, and it stays there for a while. And those conflicts can be misperceptions, by the way. They can see somebody raising their voice or talking loud in a crowd, and they perceive that as an argument and something that really gets stuck. So they have trouble switching off that conversation. And then oftentimes they'll go back to the same phrases that they want to emphasize, like, they're really going to be sorry for that. Blah, 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 blah. They're going to be very sorry for that, blah, 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 blah. They're going to get in trouble for that. So they come back to that and they reiterate that over and over again. So this individual has a backpack and she keeps a lot of stuff in the back. She's got more than one. Right now, she's showing Tracy a schedule, but as you can see, Tracy's being allowed to hold some of those pieces of paper, but she's looking for a schedule. She finally finds it, and you notice that Tracy has to give those papers back, because what this does for her, keeping track of all of this, she even smelled it. You could see she's very tied in to these pieces of paper and belongings that go with her everywhere. This is a bit of an obsession, obviously, because those of us who understand obsessive compulsive behavior know that if you keep everything with you and in a certain place in a certain way, that it helps you reduce your anxiety. So again, this is a way that a lot of individuals with Fragile X, and girls especially, will be able to sort of abate some of the anxiety. In her case, however, it's not real healthy, because you can see she is really obsessed over this stuff and she's very anxious about it. She's rocking and she's having a really hard time of letting go of any of that. And setting it down was next to impossible. We just couldn't get her to set it down beside her chair. And a lot of the girls have collections. As a matter of fact, one of my clients had a whole bunch of Power Ranger figures that she collected, and they were in the original boxes. She never got them out. She never did anything with them. So these collections, grow and grow and grow. And it's their way of trying to combat the anxiety, but it's very dysfunctional. It's a dysfunctional remedy. So again, I had the individual that collected figures and she had them in the original boxes. And of course, that was problematic because she just kept collecting them. They were really served no purpose except to collect. So here's a more adaptive remedy. And again, as we talked before, you have to remind these girls and women to use these visual charts, because their executive functioning deficits really preclude them from getting this out and using it. So they're flooded with all this anxiety and all this emotion, and you need to have a card or something visual that's going to help them remember, okay, here's the calm down strategies. Here's the breathing strategies. And those are the things that you're going to want to have available to them. They're visual reminders, and they will help them get back on track again. So now let's talk about language. It's really interesting. And I was looking for more information and I just couldn't find anything about the language of the girls. I know that this school district that I'm consulting with, that's on our East Coast, far East Coast of the United States, they're very intrigued with one of their sisters that they're seeing in special education. And the speech therapist is very intrigued with the language pattern. And she basically used these terms. She has an odd way of communicating. Her language is very odd. So what we see, and if those of you, it's real easy to get fooled because they can talk quite a bit. They can communicate. They can share conversations. They seem to have that reciprocity, the back and forth. But then when you sort of tease it apart and start to pull it apart, there's some real holes in that process. They rarely give you a referent. What that means is they start talking about a he or a she. They don't tell you who the she or the he is. So you're now trying to figure out, where are they? What are they talking about? And you have to stop in the middle of it and say, who's the she? Oh, that's my friend so-and-so. Oh, that was my mom. But there's no way for you to figure that out when you're listening to the conversation. This is something that gets in the way of social conversation, because you can imagine how some of the friends are like, what are you talking about? Who are you talking about? Also, the borrowing of the phrases that they lift from other conversations, that's very deceiving, because I have an adult woman that I see in therapy. virtually, and she will borrow conversation. She says exactly the right thing. I'm not doing what I used to do. I just don't want to do that anymore. It's rude. And what it is she's asking people for gifts all the time, and she gives them lists of things she wants. Well, that's rude. And she's been told that's not appropriate. So her caregivers get lists all the time. And if she's got a new one, she really knows that she can probably get away with something. And so once again, she'll say, but I'm not going to ask for lists anymore. I'm not going to. And then the next week I get the report from her sister, who's her caregiver, that she did it again. So you see, it's very convincing. And she's giving me all this information. She's borrowing it and she's using it in appropriate context, but yet she does it all over again. They assume that their audience or their listener was there to experience the situation with them. So they dive right into the conversation with you, and they assume you're their audience. They assume that everybody knows where they are and what they're doing and what they're talking about. So when we look at this language, I want you to listen to this individual, and that this is a girl with Fragile X. I want you to listen to her conversation with me and how clearly she articulates trying to talk about being in a new school. And
so that's why he was calling me shrimp.
What about the girls at school? How do you feel about them in your class?
Well, the girls in my class now, they kind of want, there's one girl I sat next to at lunch, and she's my only friend there. So it's kind of a new thing, because usually last year at my old school, I felt like the whole school knew me. It was weird.
so this is an interesting sort of conversation. Let's go to the next slide and talk about what we see there. So she's trying to explain, and you didn't have the benefit of the conversation right beforehand, where she was talking about somebody at her new school calling her a shrimp or something. And so now she's talking about, I ask her about the girls. And she says, that they're at the new school. And she says, now she's trying to clarify, do you mean at this new school where I am attending? And she has some challenges with these new friends. But she goes about it in a very odd way. She goes about describing that challenge in a very odd way. Even though she's talking about this new school and she's reading, repeating the girls in the class now, she doesn't clarify that she's in the current school setting. And then she talks about her only friend, her new friend. And then she reverts back to last year, trying to explain that this is really hard for her because the whole school knew her there. But then she says that was kind of weird. So again, she says it kind of this new thing, meaning that it's a different year, it's a new school year. She never really sets the stage for us. She doesn't really clearly answer the question. My question was, how are the girls there? And she goes through this explanation that goes all over the place. And again, I wanted to show this to you because this isn't really uncommon with the girls. They go about telling the story in a very odd and a way that's not joined together with a cohesive thought. So they're all over the place. She's giving me some information. It's not clear. She's trying to tell me that this is hard. She's got a new friend this year, that things are very different. Last year, she was telling me everybody knew her. I think she's trying to say people were familiar to me last year. I knew who they were. This year, it's very different. So again, you can kind of see the flavor of that. It's very difficult. Here's some things that are really hard for females. Say no. Saying no to friends or acquaintances is difficult. And so they make up stories or they figure out excuses that are just ridiculous when you think about it. I had one of the girls that comes to the group therapy, again, having problems saying no. She didn't want to go do the social activity that we had planned, okay? And instead of just saying, I don't want to, I don't think I can, she made all kinds of excuses up about a grandmother that was in the hospital and she wouldn't be able to come. I mean, there were all kinds of things going on with that. And again, she was free to say no. but she couldn't. And when I drilled down with her on that and took a deeper dive, she said, I didn't want to hurt their feelings. I didn't want to say no. So if I made an excuse, I wouldn't hurt their feelings. So once again, that's kind of what goes on, I think, is that they're very sensitive and they don't want to hurt people's feelings. They don't always use good judgment in social settings. They sort of go along with people and do things that they otherwise would not have done. Again, trying to be nice, trying to do the right thing, make people happy. They aren't real discerning in those situations, and they have trouble controlling the anxiety. They're naive about people, oftentimes trusting people to the extent where they don't ever question their motives. Spending and shopping is a big problem. And oftentimes they'll get online and oftentimes they'll pirate their mom's numbers and they can then go in and do lots of shopping. Don't always read the social cues very well. And again, that's hard for them. Focus and concentration that we've talked about before. Money management is horrible. These girls struggle a great deal. And it goes back to the math issues, doesn't it? Because they overspend oftentimes. They a lot of times don't even understand what something costs, the value. It's kind of like the work that we were doing with the girl back east, where she had to know if she had enough money or not to buy something. Again, that's problematic. Also, when we gave her the problem, it was so interesting. So here's what you have, and here's what this item costs. She transposed that, and she looked at the money that the item cost, and then she tried to look at how much she had. So she got that so mixed up in terms of that sequence of, here's the item, here's what it costs, here's how much money you have. That wasn't even computing with her. We have in the past used envelopes where we put the cash amounts out so that somebody knows they have this amount of money to make it through the week. And so they have to buy their lunch at school, they have to whatever else they're doing. And as soon as that money, and we might even put it into categories like different envelopes. And as soon as that money ran out, it was a real black and white concrete way for them to see that they didn't have any more money. When they use the debit card, it's a little bit tough because they don't really see that give and take of money and spending. And so it's a little more abstract in the process. Again, we talked about the collection, so I'm going to move on here. Activities of daily living. These are some things that really cause them problems. They often have trouble adjusting to their body changes. Breast buds, those kinds of things, wearing a bra. The sensory piece also kicks in. The tampons, menstrual pads, all of that really becomes an issue for them because it's that sensory feedback. And they also tell me a lot of the time, some of the adolescents, maybe in the adults, they don't want to grow up. They do not want to grow up. They don't want to leave their parents' home. They want to stay there forever. They want to live with their parents forever. And so this is another indication that they're growing up. And when they have a menstrual period and when they use a tampon and they have breast buds, they're growing up. They're no longer little. They're no longer like of the age where they would be with their parents all the time. And I think that's really tough for them. Also having a lot of trouble just managing sexual relationships and dealing with them in an appropriate way, having those boundaries, being able to say no to a young man. Also the birth control issue. I've had many conversations with women about, and young girls about the older girls, obviously, but having birth control and being consistent with taking the birth control. That even is difficult for them. So again, that becomes kind of problematic. Relationships are difficult for them. Sometimes they're attracted to controlling partners. Sometimes they're unable to express their feelings because they don't want to have that conflict. They don't want to be honest. They don't want to hurt somebody's feelings. They're very averse to conflict, become angry, abusive in a relationship. It can be the other way. I've had women very abusive to their husbands and even physically abusive. Also, the eye contact, the tangential conversations interfere with any relationship development. They become overly dramatic. These are the women that really have to talk about the same thing over and over again. I've got a woman who does that, and it's the same issue over and over and over. And we've resolved it, I've thought, and it comes up again and again. And then they're also self-absorbed, and they really want the attention. So oftentimes it will all go back to them, and people and partners get kind of tired of that. Work relationships, they're also difficult. And I'm not just talking about the vocational work and actually going to work. They're oftentimes very good workers. They're oftentimes on time because they obsess over that. They don't like to be late. That stresses them out. But sometimes they can't work for 8 hours. They just can't attend that long. If it includes social expectations like waiting on people and going up to like I had one girl that was working in a clothing store. That was extremely difficult because she would hide. She would basically be in the dressing room all the time, straightening things up and never attend to the customers because she didn't want that social interaction and basically with a stranger, right? So that's a problem. However, it's okay to have social aspects. Like if you're waiting on somebody and you're taking an order, that's quick and dirty, you're done. But if you have to stay with somebody and answer questions, and this girl was asked, does this fade? What color will it, this kind of thing. What color looks best on me? That was really difficult for her. And also, if there's a time limit to turn out a product, that causes a lot of anxiety. So those interpersonal skills can cause some issues in a work environment. They enjoy working with children often. A lot of the girls choose, childcare. Many of them will even we call them a community college here, which is a college that doesn't give a degree, a 4-year degree, but gives an associate's degree. And a lot of them then work on something that maybe childcare, so they can be a para with children or at a preschool. A lot of them choose animals or shelters. They love that. Food prep or even some sort of catering. They may like doing that. Again, remember, that's sort of behind the scenes. You prep the food, you take it over, you set it out on a table, and that's what the caterer does. You don't have to have that reciprocity back and forth. Some of them are very competent using eBay, posting collections, selling things on the internet, and even writing blogs. I've had a lot of them doing that. So not a lot, but I've had some of them doing that. So again, very interesting. This is a good job for this girl because she's kind of OCD. So she works on quality control at a printing shop, and she goes through and she can find all kinds of things that were not put in the appropriate box or whatever. So it's a good one. So we've sort of capitalized on her OCD and we brought it into a vocational arena where she can be very competent. And then we look at these individuals who find relationships that are lasting. This young lady just got married last year. She waited for COVID, I don't know how long, so she could actually have her wedding. She didn't want to do a virtual. It was so nice. It was limited in terms of people, but she was able to get married, and that's just really neat for her. Often difficult to meet others because of the shyness and the fear of becoming emotionally close. This individual her parents knew his parents, and they were kind of friends for a long time. And that's kind of how it developed. Common interests, obviously, friendships first and relationships second. And I can honestly say that a lot of the young women that I have seen go through various degrees of development at the end have really done a nice job with making a friend first and then getting into a relationship. The women that I've seen can make some pretty lousy choices and can sort of fast pace that whole process and not give it enough time. But communication obviously is very difficult in relationships. I've done some marital work with individuals women with Fragile X, very difficult. They can't express the problem. Sometimes they'll let me know. And then when I bring their husband in, it's very difficult for them, of course, to be as honest because they're anxious, as we all would be in that situation, but really having a hard time expressing what the problem is. And of course, that's pretty frustrating then to the husband or the partner. Social communication, again, being more appropriate with males or partners, sometimes flirting and then pushing the relationship away because it's not really, they don't understand what that means and what the next step is, right, to that relationship. So they start the flirting and then it gets a little bit too much and the person pays attention to them and then they want to kiss or they want to hug. And then that really gets them anxious. They avoid dating experiences that are difficult, so they don't deal with their issues. I've had girls that break up constantly because it just gets to be too overwhelming and they start all over again and it's great, but then it's overwhelming again when things get difficult. They can't advocate oftentimes. They have trouble saying, I'm not interested. You're a great friend, but I don't want to date you. The perseverative communication gets in the way because they get stuck on certain conversations and topics and they can't let go of them. And that becomes sort of boring to the partner. Also, the inappropriate laughing when they're anxious, and that gives the wrong impression in that situation. But sometimes things can work out. And this is one of my clients who lives in another state, but she did get married, just like the other person did that I showed you the picture of with her fiance. This one got married, and they actually met on a dating site. And Dad went to the first date because he was too nervous to just say, okay, you're going to meet him at a hockey game. That's not going to work for me. And so he even called me ahead of time and he said, this could be kind of embarrassing, and I don't know if I should be doing this, but this bothers me because it's a dating app. It's Christian Mingle, but who knows who's going to hang out on Christian Mingle, right? We don't know. So anyway, he said, I just have to go and meet this guy. And he did. And this guy turned out to be a great match. They're great friends. I don't know any more about the relationship than that. I know they're great friends. He has some issues as well, and he works at a supermarket. He's not Fragile X, but he's got probably some learning disabilities. And then, of course, she's working at a daycare center. So it's just kind of a neat deal. It's something that, I think is pretty special for her. They live in a condo that her parents helped buy. So that's kind of helping with the rent, because they probably don't make enough to really pay rent on that condo. But parents wanted them to be in a safe area where rents were a little bit higher. So they just went ahead and bought the condo so that they can make a payment to them, but it's probably not the full payment for the condo. So here's just a few things about anxiety. I know we're getting late and I don't want to keep you guys too long, but the brain studies that we have tell us that these individuals are wired differently. With Fragile X, they have that hyperarousal, they have that sympathetic nervous system going, and they tend to have trouble habituating, getting used to different sensory experiences. And this can become an issue when you're getting intimate with someone and wanting to be touched, or the person wants to touch you, and that sensory overload comes in because you're not initiating it. It's very difficult oftentimes for women. They've been documented to have higher rates of anxiety that's really manifested in social phobias and other specific phobias like flying and driving and talking on the phone. So again, when it's studied, these individuals for sure have issues with anxiety. If you look at what really triggers the anxiety, any new routine, unexpected changes, people making social contacts, calling them, phone calls, starting a job, they obsess over it so much that they can't initiate. That's that executive functioning again. They know they need to get something done, but they can't initiate it. Driving and flying, obsessing and observing a conflict, that is something that sticks with them, and they perseverate on that and obsess over that over and over again. Large crowds and noises, a lot of times that triggers that anxiety. Because they have such a fear of conflict, they don't express their worries in words, but they hide. Their shyness and kind of takes over. They cry, they withdraw, they become irritable. And so once again, that's the way that they deal or don't deal with their anxiety. Parents report daughters reach out to coworkers often and talk to them about things that are going on, but they don't talk to their parents. And I have that come in to therapy all the time. Parents are so frustrated, or grandparents are so frustrated because the girls won't talk to them about something that they may tell me or a coworker. I had one person who was going to the university, and she was basically not going to class. And until the parents got notice in the mail that she wasn't going, they had no clue. But she was sharing that with a friend who was afraid to tell the parents because they knew she'd get in trouble. So once again, that becomes a problem for them. Hyperarousal, how does it affect the girls? And we talk about hyperarousal a lot with the boys, but it starts with the nervous system. It gets overwhelmed and overactivated. And then if there's any demand, then it processes those demands and it just goes flat, doesn't it? Because it's so hard for them to regulate that arousal. Triggers for hyperarousal are sensory environment. That's when things get kind of crazy. Social interaction, any of that, loads for cognitions, things that they have to do that are going to be difficult for them to understand or to take on. As the nervous system becomes overstimulated, it really shifts into a heightened responding. And that heightened responding and reactivity causes them to do that flight or fight. They come into that and they need to either fight it or get away from it. So they're not able any longer to control their actions, and they can't self-regulate. So what that does is it leads to this disorganized state. They have poor sensory modulation. They just can't modulate their feelings and their emotions. Their attention is decreased. And again, really problematic. If they're trying to learn something, if it's at school and they're hyper aroused, it's not going to happen until they get a chance to take a break where they might, in fact, use some of those sensory activities that are calming, or even some of the visuals that we showed earlier, where they could actually look at some of those calming. So anyway, increase in behavior problems and the decrease in language. They just can't access the words they need to talk about what's going on. This is an important slide because I think it says a lot about social anxiety and daily living. There are predictive factors in social development and adolescence that we really have to take a look at. What some of the research is trying to show and look at is what part of development is predicting, will predict whether or not that social development will grow, will be normal, will be systematic in terms of strong and able to weather any storm socially. And what they're looking at is at the time of adolescence. Adolescence is critical for all of us, whether we have Fragile X or not. And that's an area of development where we're figuring out who we are and who our parents left with us and in us that we want to save, and the part we don't want to be like. It's also helping us sort of look at peers and what they like, what they don't like, what a good friend is like, and what a lousy friend might be like. And so that adolescent period is critical. It's really important. Well, it's no different with girls with Fragile X. And so again, what happens during that process? What happens in terms of making peer connections and being able to have friends? Then the next predictive factor was family dynamics. Do those families support the independence and the development of that peer relationship, or do they shore it up and make it okay? And then the other part is basically the genetics. So the repeats, which we still can't correlate, but that's something that they were looking at. The methylation status. Sometimes there's mosaicism and they're actually unmethylated in some of their cells. And so that's something that some people are looking at. So if the girl doesn't really actualize normal social development through adolescence, this is kids with Fragile X, but also typically developing, and they have limited peer relationships as people with Fragile X, which they tend to do. And those friendships become a deterrent in terms of them eventually sort of realizing, I'm not making friends. They don't like me. Because at first it's okay when they're younger. But then they get older and they start to discern the difference, and they realize that people are leaving them out of parties. People are leaving them out of birthday parties. They hear about a birthday and nobody invited them or whatever. They're starting to see that there's something cracking there, and they're really looking at hurt. That's hurtful because they're not being included. And so what do they do with that? They tend to avoid it. They tend to avoid sharing their true feelings about how hurtful that is and how difficult it is for them. Because when they share that, then we can start to shore that up. We can start to talk about, well, why do you think that is? What do you think you're doing that maybe is getting in the way of that? It's really an important sort of admission, so to speak, in terms of what's going on. But they then get into that avoidant personality disorder and they avoid it. So also, a lot of times they become friends with their helpers, with their teachers, with people in the community that are older. And again, that's not a peer. So it does separate them out, and they don't then have friends that are the same age. And even if it's just one or two, it still is problematic. And then the family dynamics, that's the other factor. How does that impact this social anxiety? Does that family say, let's go out and try that again? Does that family say, let's invite somebody over and see how that works, even against the wishes of the girl with Fragile X, because they like to avoid those kinds of things? And then also we have to look at, does that family group sort of scoop them up and protect them from those activities? Do they then say, well, that doesn't really matter. We'll go to the movie as a family. Don't worry about being left out. We're going to take you out and do something fun. Now, as any parent would do, that's what you would do, right? Because it hurts you to have your child hurt, obviously. On the other hand, we could say something like, you know what? Let's take so-and-so. Why don't you give her a call and let's see if we can go? Doesn't want to make the call. Okay, why don't we go talk to mom and her daughter and see if we can make a plan together? That's a better dynamic for the family, for sure, than just sort of filling in the gaps and making your child feel good because they've been left out. And that will be a critical factor. I think that's something we have to take a look at, because when we see that good relationships work with peers, it's because the family doesn't really sort of take care of that gap. So this is delayed social development, and it's really important to take a look at this because she will express to you how difficult it is to be delayed socially.
Inside, I'm a little kid, but I am a 19-year-old, and I like to watch shows like Jay, The Guardian, The West Wing, Seventh Heaven, Everwood.
Things like that.
Things like that.
But then what would be some examples of things that you're not 19-year-old about?
Well, I still like to, watch, cartoons that, are like from the 80s, like the Care Bears, Rainbow Bright, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Mm-hmm. So if you said to a friend of yours that was also 19, I like to watch Teenage Mutant Turtles, what would they do?
Oh,
They would
laugh,
probably,
you name it, they,
that would be embarrassing.
oh yeah.
So see what she's experiencing. She knows that her interests are different, but she also knows that if her peers heard her talk about those things, they would think she was really weird. Shyness and avoidance, we've talked about. We've talked about the selective mutism in some of the girls. Like I said, at first, I think that shyness sort of then morphs into avoiding. And if we let somebody avoid, they're never going to take on that awful task of trying to be social and trying to interact and kind of hold their own. So that becomes problematic. As they grow older, their shyness sort of manifests into this social anxiety. It can cause some problems, obviously. They feel ill when they await a social activity. They're anticipating and they're fearing it. So they do physically get ill sometimes because it's the anxiety that's kicking in. Becoming terrified to participate in a social activity when they've said earlier they're going to do it. Common for them to agree to a plan and then end the interaction, spend excruciating energy trying to get out of it, formulate a legitimate excuse. I mean, it's amazing the kind of energy that they will use to get out of that plan that before they said they would, they would be a part of. And then they also resist saying no, which causes them some major issues because they fear that they're going to hurt somebody's feelings. And we talked about that earlier. Okay, so what's a strategy? I always tell them, if you find yourself in that situation where you really want to say no, instead you can kind of say some things that might buy you a little bit of time, like I'll have to check my schedule. I need to see what my family plans are. I think I might have a conflict that night. Anything like that is okay with me because it's a strategy to get beyond the avoidance or making an excuse that's really a lie. This is not really a lie. You're just saying, let me take a little time to check that out, right? Because then they can process that with their parents or someone else. A lot of times it's me. And we can go through that together. And then we formulate an honest response. I'd like to go, but I'm really nervous about it because I've never been to that restaurant before, or because being with two boys and me alone out of the group because the other girl couldn't come makes me very nervous. Those are real problems that can be solved, right? They're admitting the truth in a situation. So if you take a minute and say, I need to check on that, or I'll call you back or whatever, and we start to formulate a more honest response, that's the way to do it. Parents do the same thing for sure. So teach your daughter to say something like, Let me check my schedule. I'm not sure if I'm available then, something like that. The buy sometimes I'll call you back, and then start to formulate what's really going on, because that's going to allow her to be honest about what those anxious feelings are about this activity, and then to develop a remedy around that. So if they can tell you, if she can tell you, you know what, I just don't like this one guy in the group. And that came out in one of our groups. And he bothers me. And he's pretty autistic. So, you know, he has that prosody in his voice, and it's kind of a weird rhythm, and that bugs her. It doesn't sound right to her. So then we talked about that, and what could she do about that? And is there a way that she could go to another group activity that had other people, so that it wasn't just that one-on-one? So again, there's a lot of ways you can problem solve that, but you got to know what the problem is first. And she can't avoid it, because if she avoids it, it's not going to happen. You're not going to be able to really retrofit that whole thing. Okay, strategies, we talked about that. More impacted females and younger females need more reassurance. These are the girls that are more impacted with Fragile X. They need picture albums. They need a social story. They need it to be very concrete in terms of what you're asking them to do. So that avoidance is going to come immediately. They're going to become shy. They're not going to want to participate. And they're not probably going to be able to tell you why. You're going to see some behavioral episodes. You're going to see them giving you a lot of issue with compliance, because they're afraid, because they want to avoid, and that's the best way they see fit. So when you see that happening, if we start to bring out a social story about the event, and we talk it through with their picture there, and you do the reading, obviously, and work it through that way, it's a better way to deal with that kind of a problem. If you also know that they're nonverbal, you have a female that you're working with or in your family that's nonverbal, it's difficult for them, obviously, to express their feelings. So what do? They communicate through their behavior. And because they can't successfully communicate, that makes them more anxious. It fuels their anxiety. They become, they kick at you, they hit at you. Well, then they're communicating, because they're telling you, I don't want to go. Okay, you know that much. Now you have to figure out why. And again, some of that has to do with maybe the activity, maybe how loud it is. You have to look at that sensory piece. If you use music to engage them, sometimes you can kind of make up a song. Susie doesn't want to go because she is afraid of the noise. So you kind of do this kind of thing, and it kind of lessens the blow, and it kind of dampers everything, so that maybe you're at a place now where they can kind of listen because the music is helpful. High interest, that might assist in that process. Here's kind of a board that I've used with a nonverbal individual, where even just telling you that she's sick, or that she needs space, or that she's nervous and anxious, whatever it is, these are her favorite characters. So we've used some of that in this process, and that's very helpful to get her to explain what it is that's getting in her way and what she needs. Dogs, great for this. This is the person that I showed you earlier. She absolutely loves her dog. She knits as well, and she uses that loom that's a circular loom that she can knit around, so she doesn't have to use the needles. Sometimes they're not real coordinated. They might be a little, because their muscle tone is very low, and so oftentimes they don't develop the athletic prowess that some of their peers have. And so again, that's problematic. So this is by Jen Epstein, and there's some pretty good ideas here. Pay attention to their body language. Now, this is their nonverbal. If they're not able to communicate very well, sometimes they get red in the face. Sometimes they chew more on things. They may grab this and chew. They might cover their face. Pay attention to what you already know about what your child likes, what helps them calm down, what objects you might introduce to provide a good distraction. Model using the feeling words that you've introduced with pictures. So they might be able to, as I said on the earlier slide and showed you, they might be able to point to, I need a hug or whatever. And then deep breathing. That's really important for them to start that process, because that does help with your neurobiology overall. Again, videos. Sometimes we take videos. I had a parent take a video of one of her daughter who's Fragile X and really has severe temper tantrums. She took a video of it, and the minute that her phone came out to videotape it, the tantrum stopped just like that, which was very interesting because that tells us that she had a lot of control over that. She didn't want to be embarrassed. Who are you going to show that to, Mom? Who are you going to show that to? The words you use are very important. So you want to help your child focus on what's going on and not use so much verbiage, because once they're hyper aroused, they're not going to be hearing anything you say anyway. So be very careful about that. Stay in the moment. Don't go around all kinds of things and get her sidetracked. Just stay in the moment. It looks like you're very upset. Let's do our breathing. So again, in the moment, few words, and then add a piece at a time. So do the breathing. Now you're upset because, and we do that fill in sort of thing so that we know that we start it and they finish it. You're upset because, and it could be pictures, it could be words. And then we start the self-regulation after that. So again, you take it in steps and you modulate it that way. This is something that I've developed that, the 10 points feeling scale, use numbers. I just broke it down to 3. And we have the little emojis, and then these are the words. So if your child doesn't read, you can see this. And what we do is then we either read to them or they read a list of things that that are hard for them. These phrases and feelings come from therapy sessions, intake questions, comments from support workers. And so we look at standing up in front of the class, because that's something this one girl said, oh my gosh, I can't do that. I just absolutely can't. She's homeschooled, but she goes 1 day a week to a school. And I can't do that. That's just impossible. There's no way I could ever do that. So I put it on this list and I wanted to know, where does it fit? Is it obviously not a 1, but is it a 3 or is it a 5? Is it a panic or is it just makes you nervous? That helps them understand their feelings a little bit better when they have to grade it. Flying, calling an order in for pizza, whatever it is, you go back up to this little sheet, and at the bottom of this sheet, oftentimes if they can read, I've got the phrase, and then they just put one of the numbers beside it. Or if they can't read, I read it to them and they tell me the number. And so it really helps me get in touch with what's really going on. And not only that they don't like it, but how much don't they like it? Is it really, really bad? Or is it sort of in the middle? Again, the social story is really important. I had a parent say, well, my kid reads really well. Well, that's okay. Social stories, you don't have to read it to them. They can read it themselves. It kind of is that. It takes it away and into a third person sort of venue. So it's not you did this, but when Susie did this, she, okay? And that's the person we're talking about. That's your child. But it takes it away from you talking directly about the situation, and it puts it into a story form with their picture on it. So they're resentful or defensive when they're redirected. And sometimes this helps so that we don't get real defensive. They don't sort of yell out at us and say, I don't want to talk about it, and I did this kind of thing, but we put it into a story format. So we talk about things that are embarrassing, like picking or sneaking food or doing something like that in the form of a social story. And you get farther with that because, like I said, it's sort of one generation away from actually talking to the person about what they did wrong. So here's a social story. I usually put a picture of the person here, and this is the person's name. Has a beautiful condo where she lives, likes to keep her condo neat. She enjoys having people visit her, but she has trouble with last minute plans. When people drop in at the last minute, it makes her upset. And this is a true story. She's an adult who does not like that. She used to put a sign up that would say, keep out if anybody came to her door. Well, that became pretty rude, and that was a problem for her, but she was afraid they'd bring their dogs in, they'd have muddy paws. When we finally drilled down and figured out what the problem was, then we could get this into a story, and she's going to try to accept that change, that people come to visit her. It's a compliment. They like to see her. They like her condo. It's welcoming, all of those kinds of things, so that she knows how to respond the next time. And then we do this worksheet where she can fill out. It's just better if you go through this once and then you start asking questions about it that really come out of their pencil. The answers come out of their pencil, not their mouth. For some reason, that helps kind of set the stage. They take more risks. They're willing to share it. So again, who has the beautiful condo? And so it goes. These are the boxes that I use too. I like these because easy and hard. So this is a little bit different than the smiley, the emojis. The emojis have 3 choices to it. I can put more boxes on these sheets, but right now to start with, I'll do easy and hard. And that's really an easy way for them to decide what this particular thing does, this phrase does to them and their emotions. So I'll read learning to drive. Sometimes we're sharing a screen, learning to drive, and they'll say, oh, that's really hard. Okay, what color is hard going to be? Well, they choose whatever color they want. And they take that and we circle it together. Now, they may not be able to read that, but they can circle it together. It's just engagement. It just helps them go through something that's tangible. Yelling. Is it hard to yell or not hard to yell? So we go through that. Probably should say not yelling because that would be hard. A place where it's noisy. Is that hard or easy? So we go through these sort of as diagnostics in terms of trying to figure out where they stand with these particular things. Videotaping, journaling, checking off chores, all of that is also a remedy for anxiety. I always like to end these lectures with words of wisdom from the experts, meaning the people who have Fragile X and what they want to tell you. And so I'm going to hand it off to Liz, who's going to be able to talk about these girls and women who live in Australia. Okay, Liz.
Thank you, Marcia. Thank you so much. So, yeah, as Marcia said, we've got some lovely words of wisdom, some personal stories shared by the lived experience of individuals, girls and women and their families. So thank you so much to those who've shared the 4 stories that we're about to talk about. So this is the lovely Olive. Doesn't she look beautiful? Olive loves mermaids and cats, and she loves the colour purple and aqua. She loves her friends, she loves YouTube and food. And Olive's just started in year 7, which is transition for many individuals, starting at high school. Maths, she says, is very tricky for her, but she tries very hard at it. She is in a streamlined class in year 7, which means that the class sizes are smaller and she has just the one teacher for her core subjects. And this, her family explains, helps manage workload and limits confusing timetables and room changes around the school. For break times and elective subjects and sports, Olive interacts with the whole year 7 cohort. So she's got that lovely balance. Her mum says that this seems to be a great option for her at the moment, as she's getting used to the academic support she needs, and she gets the social interaction that she craves. Here she is. So Olive, she just needs to be the same as any other 12-year-old girl. She wants to fit in. She's extremely good at mimic, so she canvasses what others are doing, what they're saying, what they're wearing, behaving, and the way that they're behaving, and then she copies. Some friends are okay with this and others not so much. But she has workshopped a lot of these issues with her psychologist, and there's a lovely girls group that she's a part of that looks at resilience and building self-confidence. Her mum says that a supportive teacher is always an amazing support also. The family and Olive herself have found supportive team sports have been great for building self-esteem, self-worth and resilience for Olive. She loves playing for her local netball club, and she always looks forward to Saturdays where she's part of the Cheerability group, which is an amazing group of kids with all sorts of abilities, and she loves the hair and the makeup. The camaraderie of this group is so heartwarming. This is Maddie. So Maddie is 23 and she was diagnosed with Fragile X when she was around 3 years of age. Early intervention through a social group, through a service provider was really helpful for Maddie in the first 3 years before she started school when she was 6. Her primary school was really welcoming as they understood children with special needs or additional needs. Maddie stayed in mainstream at that school up until year 2, where she learned to read and write, and she was really included socially with all of her peers. Maddie's major issue was anxiety. So when it came to new places and people, that was really tricky for her to navigate. Social stories helped her a lot in this area, and her family was able to talk to her about trying some new things. When Maddie started high school, she joined a high school that focused on children with additional needs, which was a good fit for her. It was a special needs unit because she wasn't able to keep up or fit in with regular work that was being provided for her. Her parents were a little bit hesitant to go down the special ed pathway initially, but as they say, it turned out to be the best decision ever. Although Maddie was one of the highest functioning children in the class, she needed extra support and her confidence started to grow over time. She was friends with all her classmates and really enjoyed her school at primary school. Maddie was accepted into a special needs high school, as I said, which was run the same as any regular high school. And her parents said that this school really made Maddie. It encouraged new activities and performances. She became one of the drummers and performed all around the state, even doing some solos. Maddie was vice captain in year 12, speaking at school assemblies and in public. She's fine when she's in her comfort zone, so this was no issue for her. The children in her year will be lifelong friends. Maddie loves cricket. At 8, she started playing indoor cricket, and she's very talented and won many awards. She's joined the Blowfly Cricket Club, which is a club for children and adults with special needs, where they learn new skills, play games, they socialise a lot. Maddie is now the female club captain, and she's often called in to do presentations and accept donations in front of large groups of people. So her confidence has really grown, and she's got a great knowledge of cricket. And the Blowfly Club, within that environment, she has no anxiety at all. She also coaches, and her sister Jordan is now president. And recently she starred in a TV segment for the project on Channel 10. Maddie is in a social group also called Champions. She tries anything with them. There's rock climbing, swimming, archery, and loads more activities. She works part-time. She works 4 hours a day, so that's an 8-hour week doing admin work, which really suits her. She enjoys the social side probably more than the work itself, but it's a perfect fit for her. It's an administration role, a clerical role, essentially. Maddie's anxiety is still with her, but her family is able to talk her through into trying some new things, but she can still be stubborn at times. Okay, so this is Sam. It's a lovely picture of Sam. Sam's 37 and she lives independently with her cat Dusty, who's also featured there, in her own apartment. Sam works full-time at one of Australia's biggest supermarket chains, and she's soon to receive a medal for 15 years of service, which she's super excited about, and so she should be. Excessive noise, like loud music and shouting, and people shouting, such as angry customers sometimes that come into the store, particularly around the COVID outbreak, really increased Sam's anxiety. But she managed to push through, and she's still working at the same place, which is wonderful. So kudos to her. Unfamiliar situations and decision-making can really throw Sam. When things get out of hand, she sometimes shuts down, and she's worked out some strategies to step away from stressful situations, and she has some great workmates and managers. Routines and familiarity have helped Sam build confidence and responsibility at work. She now helps open the store, she sets up the registers for the day, she's mastered complicated online orders, and she's progressed into working in the cash office now. She manages her own day-to-day finances, but she has some additional support from her mum and stepdad to help plan and manage bills. She has support from a local mental health support organisation, which offers social interaction and group activities, which she has a say in terms of her personal choice and what she likes and what she doesn't like to do. We've connected her through the association with other young women with Fragile X to share experience, and she keeps in touch with them on a regular basis. Her anxiety can sometimes prohibit her entering mainstream life, and she really wants to drive a car. So that's one of her goals, particularly as she lives in an area where public transport is particularly poor. Medication does help Sam with anxiety, and she's been very open that at times she has overindulged in alcohol as a way of coping. School wasn't easy for Sam. Making new friends has been difficult, and she does rely upon her cat Dusty a lot for company. In the past, people have taken advantage of her, as she does have trouble saying no to people sometimes. But new friendships that she's gained from work have really helped her gain her confidence in that area. Hobbies include cooking and diamond darts, which is particularly popular with women with Fragile X, I've noticed, and we're going to set up a little peer group of diamond art enthusiasts. It involves gluing coloured beads into designs to create beautiful artworks, and you can see from the image there, Sam has a lovely picture in the background of diamond art that she's done herself. She carefully sorts all the beads into groups and then follows all the directions step by step. She's recently developed an interest in birds, which was inspired by her mum, and she set up a bird bath and a feeding station. And lastly, but not at all leastly, we've got Narelle, who has been kind enough to share her experience of coping with anxiety, and she's come up with some lovely strategies which might be helpful for others. So Narelle says that her anxiety is very frustrating and can be very debilitating. She says that anything can send her off or make her feel uneasy, which often leads to make things bigger in her head than they really are. She can get upset and she can fall to pieces, and even hangs around non-supportive people that can make her feel or lead her into feeling bad and thinking horrible thoughts about herself, which can then lead to having sore wrists, being tired and moody, which she then ends up taking out on other people around her. So to combat this, she has developed some strategies which have enabled her to cope. They're things like talking to her support person, hanging around positive and supportive people, like the women from the Country Women's Association. She now avoids negative people. She's found that professional people in some circumstances, in perhaps, for example, one government agency, tend not to understand her anxiety, as they can sometimes feel that everyone gets anxious at times, and that maybe people should be taking fish oil to help. She says that sometimes they think that she's not that bad because she looks perfectly normal while being able to still talk. She's learned that this was because she'd gone into disassociation, which meant she could still function, but her anxiety was too high and she wasn't coping. People used to ask if she was okay, and she had no idea what they were talking about. Yet, she still tries to do her best and combat her anxiety. She's found ways of managing her anxiety through exercise, eating healthy food, having a supportive environment around her. These things have really helped her learn new skills, such as learning conversation techniques. She had no idea how to talk to people, and she would often just stand there. Now, with the right support, she's able to teach family history, give speeches, join volunteer community groups. She's able to go out and have a social life. And this wouldn't have been possible without three very important people in her life who she's given credit to: Janie Roberts, Barbara Shipp, and her Marianne, who've done nothing but support her right the way through. So to conclude, she'd like to say a big thank you to these women, because without them, she would not be where she is today. And another question is, any strategies to overcome the complete avoidance of trying new foods?
Mm-hmm. Oh, new food, that is pretty hard. Yeah. Well, first of all, what I've learned about that is that there are certain textures that are very difficult for some of these individuals to tolerate. And so you kind of have to look at whether or not the new food has a slimy, sort of yucky. I had somebody tell me the other day they'd never eat a canned mushroom as long as they live. And even the fresh ones are hard for them, but the canned ones, and they are pretty bad. So we've talked about, okay, that's maybe one thing, but if you're avoiding a lot and you're just kind of looking at some of those foods that are really not that healthy, but they sort of work well on your tongue, you need to start looking at chewing and maybe some raw vegetables, and maybe just doing a couple at a time and going forward. It's really important for your health, obviously. And because so often the muscle tone is low, the exercise does not occur, it doesn't happen, and we have a lot of individuals that struggle with weight gain and really some negative sorts of issues with food. So I would take a look at sort of desensitizing to some of that. My guess is it has to do with texture. It could have to do with some taste, but I think just trying to find something that's in a good, healthy category and then sort of looking at that desensitization would be good. Like a couple bites at a time, chewing, sometimes that's hard, and then just leaving it at that and trying another day.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, Marcia. That's all the questions that...
Good, yeah. I hope you all have a great weekend. It was so good connecting with you all again and having you share your stories. I really appreciated, Liz, you jumping in and sharing the stories. They were very insightful. I learned something every time I hear from a woman with Fragile X or a girl with Fragile X. They've taught me everything I know. So it's really been helpful to me too. So thank you, guys.
Oh, thank you, Marcia. Take care, and really appreciate you extending your time as well to be with us. Thanks for joining, everybody, and look forward to seeing one of Marcia's next webinars coming up. And just a reminder that there's a webinar with Bev Scher on the 1st of March around creating social stories. Take care.